Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the summer school, ladies and gentlemen, dear visitors as well, welcome to the last public lecture of the 32nd CETRA Summer School in Translation Studies. Just 2 days ago, our chair professor, Brian Baer, gave a talk about what translation has to offer to sexuality studies. And now we will reverse this and we will get something in return. And now queer studies will offer something to translation studies. More precisely, the title of this lecture is What Queer Theory Can Offer to Translation Studies. So Brian, thank you for having accepted once again being the chair professor of this edition of the summer school, this virtual edition. And we look forward to your, unfortunately enough, already last lecture of this edition.
Thank you, Peter. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, great. So I mentioned in my first lecture, and I'm going to try to bring together some of the threads from my previous lecture in my final lecture today. And I mentioned in lecture number 1 a 1978 French edition of the memoir of the 19th century French hermaphrodite Herculine Barbin, edited by Michel Foucault. And in that first Foucault edition, he included no theoretical framing. So his intention was that you open the book and you encounter Barbin's voice more or less directly. So to honor that intention, I wanted to begin my final lecture with the first paragraph of Barbin's memoir in its English translation. My place was not marked out in this world that shunned me, that had cursed me. Not a living creature was to share in this immense sorrow that seized me when I left my childhood, and at that age when everything is beautiful because everything is young and bright with the future. That age did not exist for me. As soon as I reached that age, I instinctively drew apart from the world as if I had already come to understand that I was to live in it as a stranger. Of course, in French, stranger is étranger, a polysemous word which could be rendered as either stranger and foreigner. So because polysemy is so central to Leon Edelman's concept of homographesis, which I'll talk about later, I thought that it would be a great point of entry into a discussion of the relationship or the various theoretical entanglements between queer theory and translation studies. I think it's not a stretch if we recognize that the central concern of both these fields has always been the conceptualization of sameness and difference, of borders and bordering, or to put it in Barbin's words, how one's place is or is not marked out in this world and how it might be otherwise marked out in another language and in another culture. I should also mention that the English word stranger is polysemous, having once been used as a slang term for homosexual. And in fact, that continues today. That's evident today in the title of such works as Jonathan Goldberg's essay, Strange Brothers, Shane Phelan's Sexual Strangers, Gays, Lesbians, and Dilemmas of Citizenship, and Graham Robb's Strangers of 2004. But I'm also interested in how queerness and translation are historically entangled. It's interesting to me that one of the first documented usages of the word queer was in a translation done in 1513 by Gavin Douglas. It was a translation of Virgil's Aeneid into Middle Scots. Also interesting to note that the inventor of the term homosexual, Carl Maria Kertbeny, was himself a translator, and the word homosexual first entered the English language, of course, through a translation from the German, as did many terms. In fact, the early sexuality studies was very cosmopolitan, and many terms traveled across linguistic and cultural boundaries. In the work I was doing for my book on queer theory, I was also struck by how central translation was to the emerging gay liberation movement, how those early non-Bowdlerized translations of ancient Greek texts, in particular Plato, were absolutely central. Those first appeared in the 19th century under the influence of what is often called scientific historicism, right, which compelled translators not to, or suggested that they not edit out bits that were believed to be immoral, etc. The culture should be seen as they were, to paraphrase Otto Ranke. And Bruno Perrault, the French scholar, has also noted a common etymology, noting that queer derives from the Indo-European root tverk, meaning across or trans. And so here we can connect queer sexuality and translation through their semantic proximity, right? Through the use of what Paul Preciado notes could be referred to as a prothesis, noting and the early English meaning of that term as the supplement of a word with a prefix in grammar. So trans as a linguistic prosthesis. But I also want to suggest today and explore the notion that one of the things that brings queer theory and translation studies into various entanglements are the fact that queer sexuality and translation were both constructed as abject others of the modern nation state. All right, so let me just give some of the research that supports that notion. So, of course, we know that for much of modern European history, homosexuality was construed as something foreign. Certainly within Europe, the English called it the French vice, the Germans called it the Italian vice, and in fact, "Do you speak German?" became a pickup line among French homosexuals following the Eulenburg affair in the early 20th century. So it was very common. As another French scholar wrote, l'homosexualité est toujours étrangère. It's everywhere it is foreign. And so not surprisingly, themes of travel and exile are persistent, often overlapping motifs in modern gay and lesbian literatures. For example, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room not only takes place in France, but it involves an affair with an Italian worker living in Paris. And of course, one of the first works of Russian gay fiction in the post-Soviet period was a collection of short stories titled Drugoy, or The Other. And all of the stories were set in foreign countries. The othering or foreignization of homosexuality followed the spread of modern nationalism. So Joseph Massad, in his book Desiring Arabs, documents how in the Arab-speaking world in the late colonial, early post-colonial periods, as a national consciousness was emerging, the phenomenon of man-boy love and the poetry it inspired were repeatedly in literary histories attributed to the Persians, right? This was all Persian influence, affecting what Massad terms a civilizational displacement, which is also a nice way to paraphrase translation. In turn, homosexuality was then projected onto other countries as a symptom of their underdevelopment and even as a pretext for their colonization. So 16th century English travelers to Muscovy, for example, reported high incidence of sodomy. This is in several travelers' logs. And Sir Paul Rico in the 17th century reported on, quote, the accursed vice of sodomy among the Turks. And the charge of sodomy was deployed by the Spanish as justification for the colonization of the Americas, as discussed by Todorov. And I don't need to go into this, but as I've argued in previous lectures, literary histories have also, national literary histories have also rejected translations, right? They usually find no place in those histories, which are meant to celebrate the original genius of countries. So how do we understand this shared objection, objectification? One way is to understand that they were both products of what have been called regimes of absolute difference or regimes of incommensurability that emerged in the late 18th and early centuries, along with the rise of the modern nation state, which produced modern nations as monolingual, original and heterosexual. Let me explain. In the realm of sexuality, of course, Thomas Lacour's work is hugely important in documenting how that regime of incommensurability arose in our understanding of gender difference. As he describes the two-sex model which emerged when, quote, an anatomy and physiology of incommensurability replaced a metaphysics of hierarchy in the representation of woman in relation to man. So previous models, for example, suggested that women's sex organs were simply smaller versions of male organs, and now in the late 18th, early 19th century, there emerged a model in which they were seen as diametrically opposite, often inverted forms, and so on. So this notion of sexual incommensurability became the basis of modern theories of heterosexual attraction across gender difference, culminating in Otto Weininger's today quite idiosyncratic, but at the time enormously influential work, Sex and Character of 1903, in which he argues that the greater the gender difference between the parents, the healthier the children will be that are produced by such unions, right? So again, you see what's at stake in these regimes of incommensurability. In the realm of language, I'm referring, of course, to what David Gramling describes as the invention of monolingualism that accompanied the rise of the modern nation state. Remember, I mean, we often talk about Schleiermacher in terms of foreignization and domestication, but he had many other very interesting things to say about language, and as did many of the Romantics who insisted on, of course, linguistic relativism, right? That a culture's language is its unique expression of itself and of the world. Schleiermacher went on to say that individual languages are bearers of a distinct cultural worldview, right, producing linguistic incommensurability. But Schleiermacher goes on to insist that bilingualism was in fact impossible, as it would imply, and in his metaphor, having two mothers, and he describes writing in a foreign language as, quote, contrary to nature and morality, which could easily be applied to homosexuality at that time. So the notion of a mother tongue, of course, mystified the suppression of dialect and regional languages that was necessary in creating a standard national language. And this is beautifully documented in Kippel's work on discourse networks. So such linguistic incommensurability affected what Yildiz refers to as the highly consequential political linkage of language and nation, establishing what, and I've mentioned this several times, Naoki Sakai terms the monolingual addressee as the implied target of all translation in the modern European international order based on discrete nation states with national languages. Of course, this gives birth to the paradox of translation in the post-Romantic period that is necessary because languages now are seen as mutually, not mutually comprehensible, but ultimately impossible. And this was driven home by Edmund Clarence Stedman, the US anthologist that I mentioned in my talk on anthologies, where again, he was encouraging US writers not to look to foreign countries for models for their writing, but look within the boundaries of the US. And he discouraged them from imitating the French, declaring the French language to be, quote, so constituted that we cannot transmute its essential genius, encouraging would-be writers in the US to develop their capacities in English rather than wasting their time imitating the French, which they in the end can never achieve. So in the realm of literature, of course, this regime of radical incommensurability produced a clear divide between original writing and imitation, which in the early modern period did not yet exist or exist in the extreme form that it assumed at this time. And so it's no coincidence that the period of Romantic nationalism also saw the emergence of the first copyright laws to protect works of original genius, and often left translators out. This is beautifully discussed by Fritz Gutbrot in his joint ventures, Authorship, Translation, and Plagiarism. So most recently, the queer theorist Paul Preciado, of Spanish origin, brings these two regimes of, or maybe three regimes if we consider literature its own regime of incommensurability, he brings them together in the concept of sexual monolingualism, where he writes, sexualities are like languages. They are complex systems of communication and reproduction of life. As languages, sexualities are historical constructs with common genealogies and biocultural inscriptions. Like languages, sexualities can be learned. Multiple languages can be spoken. As is often the case within monolingualism, one sexuality is imposed on us in childhood, and it takes on the character of a naturalized desire. We are trained into sexual monolingualism. It is the language that we are able to perceive as a social artifact, the one that we understand without being able to fully hear its accent and melody. So one of the benefits of bilingualism or multilingualism is that you once again may hear the accents and melodies of your own language, as he argues. So first, very briefly, some terminology. Queer is often used in the literature as an umbrella term for all forms of non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality. Historically, in English, it's a derogatory term directed at homosexuals and homosexuality that emerged on top of the original meaning, which was simply weird or strange. That term was then reappropriated by activists during the AIDS crisis, and it also emerged at about the same time as queer theory, which was a scholarly approach to the study of gender and sexuality, which was often perceived as a critique of identitarianism, right? Identity politics, based on the premise that sexuality was much more fluid and anarchic than identitarian politics would presume. That said, queer theory and queer activism are not simply products of the same historical movement. Queer theory adopted, or as Heather Love writes, drew on the energies of confrontational, stigma-inflected activism that grew out of the AIDS crisis. Moreover, of course, new meanings and uses do not necessarily relegate older ones to the dustbin of history. As I mentioned in my first talk, right, the accumulation of meanings that happens, just as translations accumulate, they do not displace previous ones or the original. And so today you could hear queer used as a scholarly positioning, as an activist positioning, as an umbrella term for non-normative forms of sexual desire, as a synonym for gay, and still as a derogatory or pejorative term. Just a historical note, the term queer theory was coined by Italian film theorist and feminist Teresa de Lauretis for a conference she organized at the University of Santa Cruz in 1990, which then became the basis of a special issue of the journal Differences. And it owes a great deal to the work of Michel Foucault, who, of course, preceded the emergence of the term. In particular, Foucault's history of sexuality was important in terms of his focus on the discursive construction of sexual subjects, that we're not born with a sexual subjectivity, but it is constructed through various social discourses, be they medical, religious, legal, and their overlapping and so on. His also important was his conceptualization of an inseparable linkage between knowledge and power, and his rejection of a progressivist teleology in the writing of history. His preference, therefore, for the word archaeology, his understanding of these different layers, and the way one layer leads into another is often difficult to determine. Just a little bit about what queer theory is, and it relates, in fact, to this idea of shimmering that I introduced in my first lecture. It's a positioning where you don't want to simply replace the dominant model with another dominant model, right? So you want to destabilize the very notions of a single dominant structure, totalizing structure. So just a few quotes along those lines. As Joseph Boone writes, it is notoriously difficult to delimit the explosion of theory taking place under the term queer, except to say that it is characterized by a high degree of indeterminacy and mobility. Again, like the shimmering, it's this, they don't want to consolidate it in a specific hegemonic form. David Halperin writes, queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. And you see there the influence too of deconstruction. And it is notoriously, and queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. And then to end with Edelman, queer is the project of interrogating or deconstructing the repressive ideology of similitude or identity itself, and to explore the gap between labels and lived experience. All right, and as Jasper Puer notes, queerness irreverently challenges a linear mode of conduction and transmission. There is no exact recipe for a queer endeavor, no a priori system that taxonomizes the linkages, disruptions, and constructions into a tidy vessel. All right, and again, trying to avoid minoritizing and dominant, but also replacing that model with another model. And so to quote Barbara Johnson, queer scholarship seeks to elaborate a discourse that says neither, either, or, nor both, and, nor, even neither, nor, while at the same time not totally abandoning these logics either. So that's the space in which queer scholars attempt to do their work. Queering translation, therefore, I would argue, involves deconstructing or destabilizing those incommensurable binaries that are so central to the ontology of the modern nation state, and that has traditionally relegated translation to the margins of literary history. So I'm going to discuss three ways in which queer theory has engaged in translation, I think in very productive ways. The first is what I'm calling the problem of cognates, or what Leon Edelman refers to as homographesis. And the idea here is that to the extent that languages, according to Saussure, are built on the difference among signifiers, not that they necessarily reflect the signified, but just simply that they are different from one another, then sameness within such a system can unleash troubling effects. And this is what Leon Edelman discusses in his seminal work in queer theory, Homographesis. Homographs, or words that when a single word represents various meanings, often unconnected etymologically, he argues the homograph holds the potential to expose the non-coincident of what appears to be the same. The homograph, like writing, confounds the security of the distinction between sameness and difference, right? So when you introduce sameness into a system built on difference, it can have this troubling effect, to use Judith Butler's term. So Barbara Cassin makes this very similar argument more recently regarding the linguistic phenomenon of homonymy, arguing that it should not be seen as an accident of language, but rather as something that destabilizes the very structure of languages. Now, we can translate this into a translingual environment, right? Apply it to translation, of course, in the problem of cognates or false friends, right? Any of us who have taught translation understand this is an especially thorny issue. There have been interesting empirical studies about how novice translators treat cognates, because of course not all of them are false. Some of them can be directly translated, but novices often develop such a fear of false friends that they will execute what theorists have called cognate avoidance, right? So even when they can translate with the shared cognate, they avoid it. And as Mitkoff et al. Writes, cognates are words that have similar meaning and spelling in two or more languages. Not all cognates are false friends, suggesting that the presence of even a small number of false friends, that is, sameness disguising difference is enough to confound the translator's security in the distinction between sameness and difference. As Mitkoff et al. Comments, in translation studies, cognates and false friends contribute to the notorious problem of source language interference for translators. So clearly this has very direct implications for translation. The problem of homophony was brought home to me many years ago when I first studied in France, and I had a wonderful instructor of French grammar, and on the first day of class she was reading through the list of student names, and she got to my name and stopped and hesitated and then said to me very diplomatically, vous êtes probablement très intelligent, mais brillant, ça c'est trop, hein? Because my name, when pronounced according to the rules of French translation, produces a homophone with the French word for brilliant. And so she was then led to violate the norms of French pronunciation, and she would call me Brian after this. 10 years before Leon Edelman theorized homographesis, or the problem of cognates, we had a very interesting investigation of that problem by Gloria Anzadulua in her seminal work, Borderlands, La Frontera, subtitled The New Mestiza. And in that work, of course, with the very title, she invites us to question the notion of equivalence, right? So we have these two terms that are somewhat similar semantically, but of course we're struck immediately by the fact that Borderlands is plural, La Frontera is singular. Borderlands is plural because, of course, her notion of the border is of something that connects two sides rather than divides two sides, right? It's a special land that is connected by a border rather than divided by a border. So what is the meaning of that slash? Is it a mark of sameness or difference, or is it both, right? So Borderlands for Anzaldúa marks a territory or territories connected, not separated by a border. And this is reflected too in her bilingual dedication of her book to Todos Mexicanos on either side of the border. So again, refusing to associate Mexicans with the state of Mexico, and again, placing them on both sides of this single borderlands. But the word frontier, or her use of the cognate La Frontera, is even more interesting, to the extent that frontier in English is a very loaded term. So yes, its first meaning is often given as border or boundary, but of course it is associated with settler colonialism in the United States. The frontier was often construed as a land that was unsettled or uninhabited, even though of course it was inhabited by indigenous people, and therefore became a site of colonization. So frontier is a border seen from the point of view of the hegemon, right? And of course, it acquired special historical resonance when it was used in the 19th century to describe the western territory of the US, and then later in the 20th century to describe outer space in John F. Kennedy's notion of the new frontier. Again, something else to be conquered, to be colonized. And this meaning is evident in the title of Henry Reynolds' book, The Other Side of the Frontier, Aboriginal Resistance to the European Invasion of Australia. So how interesting to use that loaded term in English and to use that cognate in Spanish, La Frontera. Is it like queer? Is it a reclaiming of this colonialist perspective for her? So again, quite interesting. Now, I mentioned that Inder Paul Gruel has a very interesting chapter on Anzaldúa in her edited volume, Scattered Hegemonies, which again, I highly recommend. It's very sophisticated, but it doesn't do a great job in incorporating translation. And in fact, Gruel makes the claim that Anzaldúa, quote, does not translate, for that implies the domination of one language over another. Anyone who's looked at Borderlands La Frontera knows that this simply is not true. And if it were true, of course, it would reduce her project to a series of binaries, right? Playing into that dominating, comprehensible, incomprehensible, original translation. So what she does, in fact, is far more complex. She is exploring this Borderlands as a place of semi-comprehensibility, not incommensurable, but not entirely commensurable, and so on. So she uses a variety of strategies. She includes what we might call bilingual appositives. They called her half and half, mita y mita, and so on. Very many examples of that. She uses, of course, many cognates, but often giving definitions that might align somewhat, but not perfectly, with the English cognate, and so on. She also offers translations from the Spanish with no original, so out of poverty, poetry, out of suffering, song, which she lists as a Mexican song, but only gives the English translation, and elsewhere an original Spanish poem by Isabel Parra, along with an English translation. So her linguistic borderlands is in fact filled with cognates, some of which are false friends, all of which creates a kind of uneasy cognitive terrain beyond the binaries of the nation state, I would argue, where you, as an English speaker, it's always fascinating because, of course, she uses cognates very strategically. So I'm in the state of semi-comprehensibility. The second entanglement I will discuss in relation to this novel in translation by Annemarie Jagose. She's an Australian theorist, queer theorist. She wrote this novel, however, 2 years before her widely cited Queer Theory and Introduction, which was came out from New York University Press. So this is actually her first, I would argue, foray into queer theory, and it's in the form of what Klaus Kindl has called trans fiction. So first of all, her narrator, I'm calling it a queer Bildungsroman because the narrator comes to enter a world in which she understands that notions of equivalence that she had taken for granted no longer hold. So there are scenes such as these that appear throughout the novel. Navaz, her lover and translator, who is also a translator, says that she is trying something new, that she is translating Nishimura's novel into English, then back into Japanese to English again. It never comes out the same. She makes the gesture of pouring water back and forth between two containers. Each time the plot lines, the characters, interactions, and outcomes are recognizable, yet recognizably different from the time before. Nishimura is pleased with her work. Her publishing house is bringing it out next season as a trilogy. A trilogy is no coincidence here. Almost every relationship in this book involves at least 3 people. So later the narrator would read all of Navaz's translations out of more than politeness. She, quote, "I was trying to find out how something could change while still equaling itself." And later Lillian, who's Navaz's other lover, stages a photography exhibit titled Same Difference. Of course, this is a lovely slang expression in English, which seeing it in the context of the book led me to understand how queer the term really is. And the heroine is involved in a series of relationships, as I say, none of which involves fewer than 3 people, betraying, I would say, a queer antipathy toward binaries, or what Anzadulua calls that absolute despot duality. And so understanding this as a queer Bildungsroman, I saw the heroine is moving from a multilingual regime of, to use Halliday's terms, glossodiversity, to one of semiodiversity. Now, these are terms coined by the linguist Michael Halliday. He defines glossodiversity as indicating a multilingual regime in which there is a diversity of linguistic codes, but not of meanings, right? So meanings can be transposed across languages, and semiodiversity, a multilingual regime in which there is a diversity of meanings. So translation produces new meanings. As David Gramlin argues, that paradigm of glossodiversity is, he says, historically new. It tracks with the rise of global capital, and I would argue with the rise of the modern nation state. As Gramling argues, glossodiversity empowers speakers to say the same thing in many languages, to disseminate intellectual property translingually with heightened efficiency and reduced incidence of accidental content. Right? Semiodiversity, on the other hand, stresses semantic differences across language. Although Gramling cautions it is not reducible to how various recognized languages can house divergent meaning for an ostensibly cognate concept, but also attends to how such meanings become stretched and unmoored amid historical and ecological constellations among those languages, right? And I would add, to this Bakhtin's notion of the historicity of words, that of course words will live different histories, accrue different meanings in different cultures, even if core semantic content is similar. And this is, of course, similar to the distinction made by the semiotician Yuri Lotman in his short but very meaty essay, The Phenomenon of Culture, in which he compares a model of translation built on equivalent codes to one built on non-equivalent codes. So in the first model, a message can be back translated and you can always get the original message more or less complete, whereas in the second model, you never can repeat or replicate, reconstruct the original message, but this is the only model in which new messages can be produced. And he takes this as the model for creative thinking in general and relates it to the asymmetry or asymmetrical dual hemispheres of the human brain. So just to very quickly illustrate how Jagose presents this as a Bildungsroman. So she passes from this world in which she is surrounded by representatives of glossodiversity, right? Either on the one pole, her resolutely monolingual aunt, to her polyglot lover, all within the same regime of glossodiversity. By the way, I will add, this novel is quite hilarious. If you're ever looking for something to read, even on the beach in your spare time, I highly advise it. It's also great for teaching transfiction and even as an added text in a theory course, I would argue. In any case, this is how she describes her monolingual aunt. Quote, how impervious she would be to the yammer of 2, or is it 3 unknown tongues filtering up from the yard, to the elusive authority of the Japanese English dictionary always open on my desk, its sly offering of one word for another. I imagine her taking my place at the card table as once I took hers, her unchanging sense of herself, E.R. Morrow, easily filling these rooms. I imagine her dispatching my day's translation in the half hour before breakfast, scarcely pausing where I have spent uncertain hours adjudicating between maid or hired help, between hair as black as a crow's or a raven's wing. And I would argue that her polyglot lover is on the other end of the spectrum of glossodiversity, because her translations happen almost automatically and without any angst. As she says, I look at Navaz, whose brain is full of words, English, Japanese, German, Russian, and those little switch points that turn one word into another. Navaz later asks the narrator, do you have any German? To which the narrator responds, not can you read German, can you follow it, but do you have any German? Not having any and suddenly feeling this as a lack, an impoverishment, I made that open-handed gesture you make when approached on the street to indicate that you have come out without money, that you don't have a light. So this, again, there are many situations in which when she encounters representatives of this glossodiversity regime, she's rendered speechless, right? She uses language and here not only can't think of a word, but then uses a gesture which she explains through a metaphor. And finally, another representative of this world is the taxi driver Prakash. When she goes on a trip with her lover, they get in a cab with this Prakash who says to them, in 6 years, I have taught myself English. Now I will learn Japanese. My friends all teach me when I show them around. You will give me 3 words, please. The narrator is flummoxed. I stare and stare, but the world is suddenly for me unspeakable. The neat captions that once labeled everything that we exchange with each other are no longer available. Navaz then helps out, offering the word tarmac, at which Prakash nods complacently, as if the definition is less valuable than the word, as if he always knew where the plane landed, but not the tarmac. After providing another term, pneumatic tire, Prakash makes these words his own. So over the course of the novel, and again, I don't want to give it away because it's highly entertaining, she actually begins to interfere with a translation project, intercepting the original manuscript introducing Japanese passages. So she's learning Japanese in order to introduce passages, which then go on to the translator, and with great success. The Japanese translator is very impressed by the manuscript. In any case, it all ends where she sends the final installation of her doctored, manipulated translation back to the author. And she understands now that the text is gone. It is no longer under her control. And so she writes in the final paragraph, airmails suggest absence, but I allowed those cool blue envelopes to lure me into thinking that they were more ably demonstrated absence overcome. Those letters, posted every third day, marked a trajectory that I might at any point follow. As long as I did not put them to the test, they offered me the promise of Hansel and Gretel's crumbs, a safe return, right? This notion of restoring meaning and so on. Knowing that the envelope, which has just this moment passed from my fingers as the last possible letter, leaves me stranded. Even before I let it drop through the slot, it wants nothing more to do with me. It seems final and irrevocable, like a heat-seeking missile whose pre-programmed focus on its destination allows no comfort for its source. And finally, the third entanglement I mentioned a little bit at the end of my talk yesterday, or on Monday, is the notion of translation as a form of subaltern agency within global sexuality studies. So again, early works in global sexuality studies initially construed queers in the global South as passive victims, consumers, unthinking consumers of a Western sexual epistemology with its attendant lifestyle and values, right? So it was a very condescending position, giving them very little agency in their confrontation with Western models and concepts. And John Binney argued this in his Globalization of Sex, where he says much of the previous research construed subaltern queer subjects as passive receptacles who mindlessly reproduce norms, values, and signs of transnational power, or as unwitting victims of a false consciousness. Deepesh Chakrabarty in Provincializing Europe uses this, obviously not in the field of sexuality studies, but more generally in post-colonial studies, arguing that yes, subaltern subjects were often formulated as blank slates, right? Now, ignoring the fact that they have cultures of their own into which they inscribe Western notions. So Binney attempts to offer a less ambivalent, a less passive formulation of subaltern agency as, quote, deploying and reworking symbols and images associated with the global gay to help fight their own struggles for self-determination, rights, and resistance to violence and the production of spaces and territories, while also acknowledging the allure those symbols and images might hold. So this relates to the comment made the other day by Leo Chan that in China, for example, many of these terms are taken. Their origin is quickly forgotten. They're very effectively inscribed into the target culture for a variety of target culture purposes. And so we see this rethinking of subaltern agency appearing for almost 20 years now across queer theorizing in global contexts. So for example, Arnaldo Cruz Malave and Martin Manalansan in their introduction to Queer Globalizations, Citizenship and the Afterlife of Citizenship point out the ambivalent agency of queer sexualities, their capacity, as they put it, both to dispossess and to empower. Again, not trying to say either or, but perhaps both, and that this might construct or represent the specific positionality of subaltern queer subjects. So, quote, the position occupied by queer sexualities and cultures in our globalized world as a mediating figure between nation and diaspora, home and state, the local and the global, has not only been a site of dispossession, it has also been a creative site for queer agency and empowerment. So in raising issues more specific to the use of language, so again, many times they're using translation here as more of a metaphor, but Joseph Boone and Jackson come closer to including translation proper in their formulation of subaltern agency. As Joseph Boone writes, local cultures, quote, annex the global into their own practices in ways that often make it work for them, and the same can hold for imported concepts like gay and lesbian identity or queer theory. So many times when we see queer theory circulate as an untranslatable, we assume that that means a wholesale appropriation of the Western concepts. But very often it is used in very particular ways. It's re-semanticized, reimagined, and again, the meanings expanded, altered, and so on. Similarly, Peter A. Jackson, in his study of same-sex desire and practices in Thailand, traces how Western conceptions and terminology are borrowed and in the process become as much Thai as Western, if not more so, right? And this reflects, as I argue, a broad attempt in the field to focus not so much on what is lost, but also, as Kulpa, Mizielinska, and Stasinski say, in their very nice collected volume, what is brought to life through cultural permeability, exchange, influence, or simple coexistence. So I want to end this section by looking at one of the more interesting concepts, Tom Borstorff's use of dubbing as a way to understand Indonesian queer culture. This appears in his book, Gay Archipelago, Sexuality and Nation in Indonesia. And he turns to the concept of dubbing as another attempt to what he says generate new understandings of imbrication and transference that resist the hierarchized binaries of the colonial and early post-colonial periods, right? So again, can we understand it? Yes, as dispossession, also as empowerment, and how those things work. So Bolerstov, however, and also why I like dubbing, is he doesn't allow it to circulate simply as a metaphor for some kind of cultural translation. He doesn't allow it to become unmoored from the fact of translation. And in fact, very interestingly, traces his initial interest in this concept to an actual debate that occurred in Indonesia about the translingual practice of film dubbing, as he explains in his introduction. A controversy erupted in Indonesia in the late 1990s related to dubbing, which was banned by the Indonesian government, quote, on the grounds that if Westerners appeared to speak Indonesian in the mass media, Indonesians would no longer be able to tell where their culture ends and authentic Indonesian culture begins. So then he goes on from there. So again, he situates it very clearly in Indonesian debates related to the practice of dubbing, and then goes on to theorize what he calls dubbing culture. Dubbing culture, he says, provides a rubric for rethinking globalization without relying on biogenic and arguably heteronormative metaphors like hybridity, creolization, and diaspora. In dubbing culture, two elements are held together in productive tension without the expectation that they will resolve into one. Just as it is known from the outset that the speaker's lips will never be in sync with the spoken work in a dubbed film. Dubbing culture is queer. With dubbing, there can never be a faithful translation. And I think he doesn't even need to go to this idea of faithful translation, but simply it's supported by the idea that a new translation doesn't replace older translations, right? They add to it, and you create this space of multiple voices. And of course, I would add the practice of dubbing is not in and of itself queer. We know that dubbing, the actual practice of dubbing, is preferred over subtitling in many authoritative regimes, as it forecloses access to the original script. So in fact, often you can't hear it. it is when the original script is completely erased, as opposed to subtitling, where you get to hear the original and compare it to the subtitling. And so I would argue that, like other forms of translation, it is a technique, to use the term Vincent Raphael does, or a cultural mechanism, which is a term Yuri Lotman uses, whose queer potential lies in the fact that, quote, each element articulates a different language, yet they are entangled into a more meaningful unit. It is a relationship more intimate than dialogue, but more distinct than monologue. And this again is Bolerstoff from his introduction. And so I will end there with some attempt to describe what commonalities queer theory might have with translation studies, and to suggest why it is then that queer theory began kind of autonomously to interrogate questions of translation from as early as Anzaldua's work in the early 1980s. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
You can now stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Because this has a querying effect. There's this echo. So thank you so much for your very enthusiastic talk, and also, once again, a very sophisticated talk in which we got a lot of food for thought about what queer theory can offer to us, translation studies scholars, with very interesting parallels between, for instance, heterosexualism and monolingualism. And also, thank you for explaining the true meaning of the phrase, "Do you speak German?" Which is new to me. We'll keep that in mind. So I think we have questions and comments, so the floor is open. You can just raise your hand. I see one question, but I cannot see whose question it is because the software is being a bit slow. So maybe you can just open your microphone and take the floor.
Hello, Professor Baer. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm very much interested in how queer or queer in translation seeks to dismantle the binary models of equivalence in translation, or the relationships between translation and sexuality, the textual and the corporeal, and considering translation as a sex or gender related activity, or even considering translation as a queer practice or feminism practice, or in to use Douglas Robinson's words, to fuck binaries in translation. And your ideas of bringing queer theory to translation studies. All of these insights are very much interesting to me. But however, I just find it very difficult to bring these concepts and ideas to my textual analysis in the English translation and a representation of same-sex desire in the Chinese language literature. So do you please tell a little bit about how queer and queer translation can be done in textual analysis and or in translation practice? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for that. Yes, so not all, just as with the terminology, queer theory should not be equated with gay necessarily. It's any non-normative manifestation of gender, sexuality, and so on. And so it's sometimes useful, I think, the discussion in the volume I edited with Klaus Kindle on queering translation. There's a chapter by Demont where he tries to articulate three different approaches. So traditional approaches, for example, that he says misrecognize queer sexuality, so erase it basically. Those that minoritize it and make queer manifestations identitarian and minoritarian, and then those that are queer that would allow the ambiguity to exist, right? And so this actually goes back to my first talk and this idea of shimmering, I mean, can we understand an approach that doesn't necessarily, that leaves the text open to queerness? And this is a challenge for translation. That's why translations typically end up being more explicit than original text, and why we might want to think again about translation approaches that are designed for specific types of writing as opposed to one size fits all. So again, what is the purpose of the queerness, of the ambiguity, etc.? But again, I myself trying to think through this, and one of the, again, ideas from my first talk was this idea of the accumulation of meaning, that it's necessarily becomes uncontrollable multiplicity of meaning as if we recognize the historicity of words and so on, that make us just understand how complex any attempt at equivalence would be. So there's probably not a great answer to your question, but I think these are open questions. Yes, how we apply it, how we look at it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question, Yahaya. Sorry for mispronouncing. We have another question by Yang Lingling. If this is the case, you can open your microphone. Or maybe you just wanted to raise your hand. That's also a possibility. Or something is going wrong, technically speaking, I don't know. Any other questions or comments or thoughts you want to share? Brian, I have a question. In the last section of your presentation, you talked about the queer potential of dubbing. That on the one hand, it's never faithful translation. On the other, it doesn't make the source text accessible because the original intonation and voice is erased. Then what should we think from a queer theory perspective of voice-over translation, which, as you know, is still a very common practice in Russian movies and serials? Then we have still have access to the original voices, but we have often a very monotonous voice on top of this. What would queer theory say about that?
Yes, and again, I was talking more about Wollerstorff's conception of dubbing, but one thing I would say, and why I like his conceptualization, is that it is so context specific that he takes it beginning with this controversy in Indonesia about the actual practice of dubbing and what it means, right? And then the government actually outlawing it. So these things are quite context specific. And I think that's another kind of caution of queer theory, because it's very suspicious of these totalizing models, that the role of context is hugely important. The historicity of words that is always lurking there beneath the surface. These are points. Or again, that sameness, which lurks within our linguistic system of difference, and that is confounding. That, you know, as we say, even if you teach translation, and you know the whole problem of false friends, and so it is indeed confounding. So it's troubling. It's not simply saying that, oh, we should do things differently. No, we recognize the troubling effects of sameness within the system of supposedly founded on difference. So I think that's the queer intervention. But again, if we look at it in terms of a context and the huge role of context here, Tessa Dwyer has a fantastic article about Romania, which was one of the only Eastern European countries to practice subtitling as opposed to voiceover or dubbing. And because of that, they were able to have access to the original. And she says at a certain point in late communist Romania, they had subtitling parties where someone would redub the things, sight read the original, I guess, yes, sight translate the original so they could compare it with the official subtitles, right? So this became this very interesting site of resistance within Romanian society, made possible by the government, the culture's practice of using subtitle instead of dubbing. So again, I'm leery about making too global of a statement about the queerness of these practices, but specific contexts bring out queerness in certain ways. And again, that's why I like Buller's stuff, that he starts with that debate over overdubbing that was initiated by the regime's uncomfortableness with this practice. And I would say not so much, he uses faithful, which I don't think is the right term from a translation perspective. It's the idea that the non-syncing of the words tells you that it's not the same thing. So it could be a close translation, but this slight non-syncing of the lips reminds you always, okay, this isn't the exact same. This isn't what they said originally, right? This is something else. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I think we can thank Brian for another very inspiring talk. Unfortunately not the last one, but we still have you in the summer school, and we will still be able to involve you in the discussions until Friday. So I want to thank all the visitors, and of course the participants of the summer school now can have a little break, and in 20 minutes we will have a Q&A session. So thank you a lot, Brian, and thank you all visitors, and take care. Bye-bye.